So we have to prioritize. I know you want to date with someone. I know you are lonely, but if you want to achieve this goal, let's calculate. You don't have time. So at least till April, you have to finish this part like that. Prioritize. And then some of successful founders, they have family, they have 3 kids, so they can make time with family. That's why they can focus on working time, super short but so into zone. Hello guys, thank you so much for watching our episode today. How are you? So today's episode is kind of special. So my new friend Shalini, she offered me to interview me. It's funny, right? Because of thanks to your help, our podcast achieved over 50k, and also last month in March, my LinkedIn followers achieved over 5k followers. That's why we did this special episode. Shalini is a wonderful interviewer, actually. Okay, so let's get started. I want to introduce my amazing new friend, Shalini from Ireland. Right? So could you please introduce about yourself? Just like 1 minute.
Perfect. So hi there, I'm Charlene, and lovely to meet Kaori here as well in Tokyo. So I've been in banking in London for the past number of years, and I also love to help people with their financial literacy and help startups and VCs as well. So connecting with a lot of founders while I'm in Tokyo at the moment. Perfect. So let's get started. And Kaori, if you don't mind sharing a little bit why you started interviewing people.
Okay, so I have a little bit unique background than other Japanese people. I am a bilingual working at 2 startups, and I love to listening people who moved to Japan with technology skill. And then some of them, they already have permanent visa. Okay, so curious. That's why I started to listening their story, started to write articles. But why not? We can do just a podcast.
That's very helpful for startups, founders, and anyone who meets you, because you bring out their story a lot more. You bring their story to life and share it with others. So it would be great to find out a little bit more about, say, your podcast, AI Founders Mindset, which is also on YouTube. So go check that out. Through this podcast, you interview many people and you understand their mindset. So if we were to flip the script, is there a mindset that has helped you just in life? It would be great to hear about your mindset.
I see. So I think many people hesitate to start new things because of it's step out from comfort zone, right? So just do it, and then not to be perfection is the mindset of me, and also what I learned from a successful founder.
So what is the hardest part about interviewing people?
Yes, hardest part is so before kind of narrowing to category only founders. Previously, at least till last summer, I interviewed many people, not only founders, more like artists. That's why kind of it's difficult to get subscribers because of be specific, be niche is maybe key to start YouTube or video contents or articles. Before narrowing the category, I struggled to. It was difficult.
And from all the people that you've met with a lot of successful people. And are there any habits or traits that you find are in common with the people that you've met and spoke to?
Great question. So the successful people, VC or founder, they can manage their priorities. For example, there are many fun things. Living in Tokyo, living in San Francisco, living in London, food experience, dating, Netflix. But our life is 24 hours and 7 days. So we have to prioritize. I know you want to date with someone. I know you are lonely, but if you want to achieve this goal, let's calculate. You don't have time. So at least till April, you have to finish this part like that. Prioritize. And then some of successful founders, they have family, they have 3 kids, so they can make time with family. That's why they can focus on like working time, super short but so into zone. Like get up morning earlier and doing work, and then like night time only for family like that. Amazing. So managing time, prioritize is what I learned from them.
Wow. And what is the biggest reason, or even the few reasons, that you've come across where people don't succeed but they fail? The biggest reasons for failure that you've seen?
Yeah, kind of the same. They don't do prioritize. Okay. Or like cannot say no. Like yes. That's why they enjoy karaoke or go for drink with strangers. For example, I would say guys, they can live in Japan but go to bar. What are you doing? Your priority is not tourism. You wanted to start your own business, right? But yeah, just like hang out with people. Okay, that's why they didn't make succeeded, or they didn't make their company, I would say.
Okay. And also, from being very heavily involved in the startup space and the investor space, you must come across a lot of different ideas, whether ideas for new companies, how to help social impact causes. Is there an idea that you would like to see being built and created that does not exist already?
I have 2 ideas. One is fintech. For example, so in Japan, we don't have a culture to talk about investment. So many Japanese people, including me, we are thinking investment equal gamble, dangerous, don't do that. And then if they put money, salary to one bank, they don't change their bank in entire life. But in States, when I was in New York, so depends on bank and depends on years. Like what can I say?
Like the interest?
Interest is changing, depends on time, right? Often that's why they can change main bank or. But anyway, they manage. So I don't have such a financial literacy. So I would have to use fintech software or product which gave us financial education super easily, simply. I don't know, maybe it's kind of content creation or content creation / investment app, or I don't know, but I wish I knew it.
Financial literacy is a massive issue. If you want, we can also talk and have another podcast session all about financial literacy, because even in Ireland and the UK, there is a growing investment culture and people wanting to learn more about their finances, but it's still in its infancy. So it's interesting to hear your take on how it is like in Japan as well. One key takeaway from all of the people that you've met and that you've interviewed, is there one key takeaway that you've learned for yourself?
Okay, so what I learned from this 1 year of podcasting is, so there are some people who has the mindset give first. So maybe giver and taker, and the middle is dependency. So many people are dependency. It depends on, I have a big title of Google, they want to talk to me. Or if I am Julia Roberts, people love to come to our events, right? So dependency. So I want to focus on giver, like giver first. And they can say, how can I help you? This is a magic word. I also use this word because of when I interviewed someone, or if I found interesting person like you, if I can say, how can I help you? I like your activity. I want to encourage your activity, so that this person's eyes opening and they're kind of shiny, and then started to have a conversation, and then idea spark, like making chemistry. So I saw such a situation a lot. So I want to be like this person, like the person who can say, "How can I help you?" And then these type of people mostly successful. So I want to learn their attitude, behavior, and the secret of success.
Oh wow, that's amazing. Yeah, a give first mindset. That is fantastic. And actually, we've spoken a lot about startups and your podcast. I would like to rewind a little bit and get to know you a little more. Who is Kaori Ray? Because when I first met you, I saw, okay, you're meeting with different founders and people, but what got you to that point? If you can maybe share a little bit about what happened before the podcast and also how you came to start your podcast.
Thank you so much for asking me, Shalini. So my original background is, are you okay? Your hand.
It's okay, it's fine.
I can help myself.
Arm workout.
Oh, are you sure?
I'm sure
Okay,
it's
okay.
Just sit and relax. You do this all the time.
So my original background is UX design at startups. So one startup got fundraise from Y Combinator, but they couldn't success. And second startup was Japanese kind of a big startup. They failed because of they couldn't pivot. That's why they lost tons of clients. Anyway, thanks to these failure startup experience and second startup, when I got laid off, I got salary package. I don't need to worry about current financial. I visited Silicon Valley last summer because before visiting them, I met some Silicon Valley founders at Take Off Tokyo Conference 2024. Okay, I have never ever been to Silicon Valley. Why not? And I jumped on there, and I did kind of a give first activity. When some people asked me to help their event, I did. Why not? Volunteer, and enjoyed the moment and met cool founders. Some of them, they like my activity and they offer me to stay their share house or apartment free. It's amazing, right? And then I couldn't stop to listening their story. So loneliness and also want to be sponge to listening good people's story, I would say. So, and then people love my activity. Okay, I got thank you to these people. Why not? I want to keep going. Even I do bootstrapping using all money. So it was my 2024. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And it sounded like this happened very organically. And I would love to know, and I'm sure the viewers would also love to know, and everyone who you've interviewed, I'm sure everyone is curious to find out, how was the experience for you in terms of, were there any challenges? From what you said, you organically started speaking to people, which turned into the podcast. But were there challenges that you faced along the way? Whether it's, you mentioned the loneliness piece. Did you always have this confidence that you have now? I would love to hear.
Okay, so loneliness. For example, at least till 1 year ago, I obsessed to back to New York because I was living in New York. I imagined my future in New York, but I kind of broke up with my future in New York, and I came back to here. So that started to listening to my internal voice. Why do I want to back to New York? Why? And then A/B testing. So I thought going back to New York, if I can go back to New York, I can be happy. But it was wrong. So because of my priority, my passion is interviewing founders and VCs who want to support startup ecosystem. So I couldn't find such a type of community or people in New York. Maybe there are few. So that's why. Okay, now current my life stage, not New York. I had better to back to Silicon Valley. So I bought a ticket again and then went to back to San Francisco mid-summer last year. And it was great decision, I believe.
That's amazing. This happened pretty quickly. All in the last few years, actually. Yeah. One.
Yeah. 1 year, of course, before New York, and then came back, and then 1 year A/B testing.
When you say A/B testing, can you expand on that? What do you mean by A/B testing?
Yes. So, like you and us, we can try to having life A, for example, in your hometown, life B, maybe in Tokyo, big city, or life C is abroad, London or New York or San Francisco, and then we can try. If you don't have a like romance partner, why not? I recommend to try it, and then A, B, sometimes C, and then we can decide what is my priority. So this time, I want to focus on this part. So go back to A or go to C, like that.
Wow, that's amazing. And actually, following from that, where do you see your next steps, whether it's with this podcast, interviewing, or just even personal?
Thank you so much. So next step is from next week, I'm gonna go back to San Francisco because of last year I started to foster my community in there. So I want to meet my people in Silicon Valley again, and also my long-term goal is to learn entrepreneurship education and business investors education, maybe from Mecca of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and they want to bring to Japan, so that maybe this is like good for helping foster good startup ecosystem in here. So not quick, just step by step, I want to do it. So in order to achieve this lifelong goal, I need to be open to show my vulnerability and weakness to my professional friends. For example, I'm not good at to make money, please help me to asking to you or asking to my VC friends. They give me super practical tips, right? So I want to be open and then asking to people's help and then making my business. This is what I want to do this year.
Oh, wow. And when you're asking these questions, say when you're having interviews with people, the questions that you ask come across so naturally. You have a lot of confidence when you are interviewing people on and off screen. Like when I met you, like when we met like outside of this, just so much confidence, you know, and enthusiasm and bubbliness and just a lot of energy. Have you always had this confidence in you?
Good question. No, actually. So my game-changing moment was when I worked at expensive whiskey bar in Tokyo. Oh my God, 7 or 8 years ago. I found my strength is easy to remember people's information. For example, come from Osaka University. The person has 3 dogs, and this person has a wife from somewhere, like this information. And then when this customer come to our bar, I can talk this story, and then they really love me. Okay, I found my superpower. Why not I can polish my skill? It was my first step.
Oh, wow. So you've really been building this skill for many years. Wow. And I have to ask this question. Can you tell us a little bit about your best friend?
Yes, so my best friend is a one journaling notebook. So in my bag, I can show you. So actually, Sharini also love journaling. Yes, we are both. Yes. So thanks to this journaling, even just 20 minutes in a morning every day, I can reflect myself. How was my yesterday? But am I okay? If I have anxiety, what is this? Okay, if you want to solve my anxiety problem, how can I solve this? Or if I cannot, what is the plan B? Like this. What can I say? Maybe this method is cognitive something, right?
Cognitive behavioral therapy, something like that.
You are right. So naturally, I'm doing, and then it's helping my.
Is it like managing your energy or understanding how you feel?
Yes, both. Maybe managing my energy condition, and then I can be stable, and then start to work or ideation. This is my super important daily routine.
Oh, daily. Okay, is there a way that you journal? Do you write Dear Diary or do you mind map? How do you journal? Because you seem to journal in a very effective way, and that would be fantastic to share.
Every morning I can open my notebook and self-reflection from yesterday. At least 3 good things. I cooked by myself. Yay! I practiced yoga 30 minutes yesterday. Yay! I called to my mom. Yes, I'm a good person. Wow! And then I can feel better, and then starting to write down to-do list. And of course, at least once a month, mind map. Maybe I have many ideas, but I tend to be messy. How can I prioritize? Doing a mind map, and then okay, this is priority. This is maybe not this year, like that.
Very good for personal development and personal growth. I know we were talking about that before, and we were talking about vision boards as well. Vision boards. How do you find that vision boards help? Do they help you?
Yes, of course. We are both love writing. So before creating vision board by Canva, I did kind of drafting, writing, and then started to make vision board by Canva.
I think it's a great way to just see all of your goals in one place. And actually on the point of self-development, personal improvement, I find that even as you talk about journaling or all the experiences that you've had, it's like you're finding different ways of investing in yourself, investing in your own personal growth. What has been the best investment that you've made in yourself? Whether that's personal development, time, energy, money, best investment that you've made?
Amazing. Thank you so much. My best investment was moving to New York 6 years ago. I couldn't speak English, not at all. I had to go to language school. I had to go to language meetup. But thanks to this practice, and also my personality is don't be perfect. It's okay, right? So living in New York is my big investment, and also pandemic happened, so I got certificate of UX design course from Google. This is also one of the investment. I deleted Instagram. I deleted Twitter from my phone. I wanted to focus just study. And this 2 months was super good for me. That's why I could go to startup community. And also lastly, there are many sad things happen. But these sad things, we can use as a catalyst. Okay, I want to be happy. I want to be kind of positive revenge, so that be happy, be better person is improve yourself than yesterday myself, right? I don't want to pity. I want to be better, and changing mindset, doing new things, experimentation. is maybe my third investment in these 2 years.
Wow, that's a fantastic answer. And I was actually going to ask, it's something similar, which is what would you say to yourself even 2 years ago, before you started this podcast? What is the advice that you would give to younger Kaori?
Great question. So I want to tell to my previous Kaori. Hey, the person who can make you happy is only you. Because of I tend to obsess to the lover or the friend. Okay, this person makes me happy. So kind of passive, right? But no, don't be passive. Only yourself. This is my key takeaway, and I want to tell to my young era.
Oh wow, I think that's advice that anyone can learn from. And actually, for the viewers, for everyone even who you have interviewed, you've met, people that are just tuning in and just getting to know you now, what is one thing that people don't actually know about you?
Okay, I didn't get COVID. Pandemic.
Me neither.
Really? Yeah. But I didn't get COVID, but I lost my teeth. One tooth. I chewed a super hard cranberry seed, and then my tooth was super kind of not good tooth. Japanese dentist made a kind of fake tooth by plastic, but not good quality, so it fell out. Oh, but no dentist because of 2020.
Wow.
So sweet. So I went to drug store and bought a paste, kind of a glue of like a grandma's fake tooth. Okay, say glue, bondo. Yeah, and then plus my plastic tooth and the paste and. But when I was laughing, the tooth was like falling down. So, and then I had to call to dentist, but they are closing. So after a few months, finally I went to there, and then I decided to do implant. Implant also kind of expensive investment, but it was great. Wow. It was another story. Yeah.
Another good investment.
Yeah. Yes. Now I have a good tooth.
Oh wow. That's been amazing. Actually, is there anything that you would like to share with the viewers, with people that you have met before, people that are just meeting you for the first time now? And yeah, is there anything that you would like to share?
Okay, lastly, right? Okay, so I gonna go to Silicon Valley, and if you or your company want to promote like a self branding or want to advocate something to foster good startup ecosystem, feel free, please reach out to my LinkedIn.
And subscribe to the YouTube channel.
Yes. Thank you. Please subscribe. So Charlene is amazing, my new friend. Actually, we met last week. Can't believe it.
Yeah.
So we are hosting some social good event in Tokyo and Silicon Valley, maybe London in this year, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Please stay tuned. Please check. You have your YouTube channel, right? Please follow.
I do. I've just started a YouTube channel recently talking about mastering money and energy. So banking, from the banking space, but I also do a lot of energy healing work. So wanting to share some information on how people can master their personal finances and also managing their own energy. So another topic that we both have a lot to talk about. But thank you very much, Kaori, for sharing a little bit more about you. I have been wanting to know more about you behind the mic, and so it's great to hear all of the things that make you you. And stay tuned, everyone.
Yeah, stay tuned. Bye. Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope our conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. And if you have your something question or something want to let me know, please reach out to my LinkedIn DM. Okay? Bye bye. Ciao. またね.